This is FreshEd, a weekly podcast that makes complex ideas in educational research easily understood. I'm your host, Will Brim. Today we explore foundational learning in low and middle income countries. My guest is Michelle Kaffenberger.
The approaches that we are finding do work, address multiple pieces of that puzzle at once. And so there's a couple approaches that kind of get a lot of attention these days. One is called teaching at the right level. Another is called structured pedagogy. That one especially is a bit of a wonky name. But what these approaches are doing are addressing multiple constraints in the education system at once and in an aligned way, in a way that's aligned for what children need to learn, with the skills that they need to be learning, and with the pace that they can be at.
Michelle Kaffenberger is the Director of Evidence Translation at the What Works Hub for Global Education at the University of Oxford. I spoke with her on the sidelines of the Development and Education Conference held in Melbourne, Australia last week. Michelle Kaffenberger, welcome to FreshEd.
Thanks, Will. It's great to be here.
And we're doing this in person, which is actually quite unusual for me. So it's wonderful to meet you in Melbourne. So I want to start with kind of a big question, but kind of get us really focused in on the topic today. How would you define foundational learning?
So I define foundational learning as those foundational skills, primarily literacy and numeracy skills, that make up the building blocks of all the later learning that we want children to be able to do. The foundations, as the name implies, but they form that starting point. And these are skills that children should be learning in the early primary school years. And they matter a lot because what we see if you look at children's kind of learning trajectories in a lot of contexts is when they miss out on these foundations, their learning kind of flattens out in later grades. They can't engage in those later learnings. When I think foundations, I think the things addition, subtraction. You can't learn division if you haven't learned those. So the foundations that make up those building blocks. And as the late great Giran Bihari, who I often still quote, he had a great analogy for this. He would talk about education as a skyscraper, and he would say the skyscraper represents the aspirations and the ambitions that we have for children. You know, these are big ambitions. We want a lot for them, but you can't start building a skyscraper with the windows. You can't start on the 30th level. You have to start with the foundations. And so these are those foundations, the literacy, the numeracy skills that help build up everything else is where you have to start. And that's how I think of foundational learning.
Right. So it's sort of like, you know, we might as educators think critical thinking is really important and we need that in our students and in our teachers. But if you don't have these foundational skills of reading and numeracy, you can't get to critical thinking. It's the building blocks, like you said.
Yeah, and it's actually really disempowering for children when they don't have these skills. So it can be a bit controversial to focus on the foundations because it feels like it's too simple, but I actually think of it as one of the most empowering things that we can do for children is make sure they have these foundational skills because that's what kind of opens the door to engage in lots of later kind of educational opportunities, other skills we want them to learn and things like that.
Is there any data on like how many children globally don't have these skills?
Oh, there is, and it's a great question because there hasn't been in the past. It's a kind of a newer phenomenon to really have this level of data that we have. And we do know from lots of different places, but somewhere on the order of 70% of 10-year-olds in low and middle income countries can't read with meaning. And you can draw on different sources. That's a World Bank one that gets quoted often, Learning Poverty Measure. I've done analysis myself on looking at, like I mentioned, learning trajectories, which traces children's learning from grade to grade. And some of the early learning trajectories work that I did showed that across 10 low and middle income countries, half of the young adults who had finished primary school were functionally illiterate. So you also have to think about, these are children who are in school. They are sitting in school for as long as 5, 6, 7 years, and they leave unable to read. It's a very disempowering experience for them.
And so you say this is a new idea. That seems strange to me in a way, because wouldn't you think like being educated in the sense of literacy means to be literate at like a fundamental level, and then you sort of build up from that. So like, how new is this idea? It's
a great question. So literacy, not a new idea. That's been around for a long time. Recognition of the kind of low learning achievement that we see now, that historically has not been as recognized. And so if you look at the kind of evolution of the global education sector, in the early days, it was very focused on schooling attainment. So going back to say like the 70s, there was a big push to increase schooling in low and middle income countries. I actually think it's one of the biggest achievements of the development endeavor. Nearly every child now attends school, and that was less than half 50 years ago. Huge achievements, getting children in school over those decades. But it was always based on the assumption that learning would follow schooling. If only you get children into school, the learning will follow. So the focus was on school. And so it led to a lot of education systems that were very logistically oriented. We are constructing schools, we're procuring desks, we're hiring teachers, very kind of focused on those types of things, without very much attention on what I would call the kind of softer side of what are teachers doing in the classroom, what are appropriate and effective pedagogies, is the curriculum well tailored to what children need. And so we saw that big evolution in schooling advancement. And then it was much later, it's only been in the last 10 years or so that the data on learning has really come to the fore. And there's been this much larger recognition that children are in school, but they're really not learning. Oh, geez, we better figure that out. Let's do something about that. We thought they were, we didn't. Now we know. Now it's on us to address that.
I mean, I can see the progression of this idea, and you sort of do need to worry about the inputs initially. You can't really focus on learning if you don't have enough schools, right, or enough teachers. Mm-hmm. So I can see there's a logical progression here. And it makes me sort of start thinking about measuring, right? Like, so the measurement of the number of schools or the number of desks is pretty easy, right? You can count those things quite easily. Class sizes you can count. What are some of the issues around measuring learning, particularly cross-nationally? I would imagine that is quite this really difficult methodological issue.
It is and it isn't. So I would agree that, yes, the more logistical-oriented things are much easier to measure, which I think is also part of why they took kind of prominence, because it's much easier to know. Have we built the schools we said we would build? Yes, we have. Learning is harder, but there have been a lot of advancements on kind of simplified learning measurements that can capture some of these basic skills that aren't so complicated. So what I would say is a lot can actually be gained from relatively simple measures. So there is a much more complex space of learning measurement it does get complex, it gets quite complicated, it can get very expensive to develop those assessments. That's one piece. However, a lot of the advancement in knowing what children have learned and what they can do come from relatively simple measures. So like the learning trajectories that I mentioned earlier that I analyzed, a simple literacy test that was added to a household survey. We have a new module in the MIX survey, which are a UNICEF survey that has literacy and numeracy skills. It's household-based, so it's capturing children who are both in school and out of school. It's not overly complicated, and it's a huge achievement to unlock kind of better knowledge on what children know and can do.
And I would imagine there's probably a lot more work that can be done with the psychometrics and getting them sort of, well and contextually specific, but also comparable across contexts, which it's a massive sort of question mark in my mind. But with the data that does exist on learning, what do we know about sort of its impacts on the benefits of learning in the future, right? So like the returns to learning, let's say.
Yeah, so it's really intuitive that learning would have big impacts for later life. That's why, we invest in it. But it's helpful to put numbers behind that, right? And to be able to kind of, and show alongside maybe other options for investment. And here again, there's a lot more evidence on the returns to schooling, because it's easier to measure. And you can get stronger kind of counterfactual measures. Did the school exist? Did it not exist? And get those measures out there. There has been less, again, historic evidence on the returns to learning. But recently, with the What Works Hub, we undertook a synthesis project to try to unpack the evidence that does exist on learning. And when we actually went to dig for it, there was more there actually than even I expected. So we were a little pleasantly surprised. A lot of it's based on correlation, not causation, because again, it's harder to get to causation with learning. But we found some pretty big impacts. And so even if half of it is a causal impact, that's good. So for example, we found learning is associated with a 2 percentage point increase in the GDP growth rate, 11% increase at the individual level in wages. We found increases in the secondary school transition rate. More children move from primary to secondary, which is a big priority for a lot of governments. Lower dropout rates, which again, I think is really intuitive, but it's so helpful to have the data to back it up. Children who are learning are more likely to stay in school because they can tell they're getting something out of it. I think, again, going back to, it's very disempowering to be sitting in school kind of not being able to engage in what's being taught. And so there's a correlation there with dropout. And so when they are learning, we see they stay in school longer, they're more likely to transition to secondary, they get more out of those later years of schooling. Increases in youth employment, which is also a big priority for governments these days. And on the kind of more social side, reductions in women's fertility, fewer children, to women who learn. Again, these are learning impacts, not just schooling. And reductions in child mortality, upwards of 2/3 reduction, like a 67% reduction in the child mortality rate for women who gained literacy in addition to finishing primary school, not just finishing school by itself.
Yeah, and I think you're right that those are very intuitive, right? Like you would imagine, like I can easily imagine someone who is literate and numerate would have those benefits in the future. Now, it is, like you said, good to quantify, and that can help with policymakers, et cetera, et cetera. And there might be some problems with how things are measured, but in general, like you said, like we see some associations. They're also sort of predictable and common sense, and that's a good thing that we're seeing those correlations.
But on that, it's helpful to have the numbers in general. It's even more helpful, I think, in those conversations with government partners, because there's also, within an education budget, there's choices to be made. Should we build more schools? Should we reduce class sizes? Or should we focus quite closely on foundational learning? Should we focus on TVET? There's a lot of choices to be made within that. So actually to be able to show investing in these primary, school level foundational skills has high returns, it's worth doing, even relative to the other educational options.
Yeah, exactly. And so you can see where some of the politics then comes in, right? Like of how choices are selected. And this is where, even though there's evidence to suggest something works, quote unquote works, some governments might not adopt it for their own sort of domestic political reasons, right? And even with the best of data, they still make slightly different choices. What are some of the, from your perspective, what are some of the critiques of foundational learning? Because I know it's a pretty hot topic in the literature, and some people are adamantly sort of, think it's a silly idea to sort of go down. So like from your perspective, someone who's working in a What Works hub, really sort of emphasizing foundational learning, finding the evidence, showing that evidence, sharing that evidence with governments. From your perspective, how do you see some of the critiques of foundational learning?
Yes, it can be more controversial than you would think it would be to focus on foundational learning and to prioritize it. And I would say, one of the arguments, it's too simple or too simplistic. We should be doing lots of things all at once. Critical thinking, there's lots of kind of advanced skills. We should do more holistic approach to education. And there's lots of other things that we want as a part of children's education. And so what I say to that is yes, absolutely. Actually, going back to the skyscraper analogy, absolutely, we have huge aspirations. I personally have huge ambitions for the kind of education that I want to see children in these contexts achieve and have it open the doors for them. And so it's not instead of, it's the starting point for everything that follows. And if you don't get off the starting line, you're never going to get to the finish line. And so going back to these are the building blocks that they need for all those other great ambitions and aspirations that we have for them. And then kind of a related point or critique are arguments to be doing lots of things at once. Say, yeah, foundational skills matter, but so does secondary school, so does TVET, so let's make sure we do a little bit of everything. And in that context, yes, obviously all those things need to have some progress, but there's also a place to prioritize and say, if we spread ourselves too thin, we can't improve everything at the same time. Let's improve the building blocks that are going to unlock those others, and then as the kind of the trajectory of the education system continues, those investments should follow. But if you don't prioritize, you can just get really spread too thin and not be able to progress any of them all that well.
Years ago, I interviewed Eric Hanushek on the podcast, and I remember him saying something around, because he was really interested in learning, and he has this idea of knowledge capital, which is about the gains, the economic gains from learning rather than years of schooling, which is human capital. And I remember him sort of saying, why he was interested in literacy and numeracy. Like he literally just said it was easier to measure, like cross-nationally and well. He didn't actually use the argument around the building blocks and this is like a foundation for the future. He was just like, as an economist who deals with numbers, it is so much easier to deal with literacy and numeracy than any other type of skill that might be taught to children, even at the primary level, right? He's just to get the data, that is the best measure. Is there an element of that too?
No, I think that's great. So, and actually, his work is the underpinning. He did the macro work. The synthesis that I mentioned was trying to get into so we cite obviously a lot of his work, and then was trying to get down into the micro level as well. But he has been one of the ones kind of who has pushed that link between learning and outcomes ahead. There is truth to that it's easier to measure. I don't think that's as persuasive of an argument to make. I'm trying to picture some of our partners and government partners at the Hub. I don't think saying it's easier to measure would be a very persuasive argument. But as a researcher, I do appreciate the things that can have data behind them. I would argue from maybe more the place of kind of unlocking the later skills.
I think it's fascinating because I think there's sort of a public policy question, right, and how you change governments to adopt certain policies over others. And there is a researcher question. And, they might align in the end, but sort of like how they got there might be different, right? And so I think what you're sort of saying is that we need to sort of take on like a different rhetoric to justify what we're doing in different times, right?
And even to pick up on one of the things you said, you're talking about convincing the government partner, but like I try to think of it as supporting them, because we should only be quote unquote persuading them to do things that are kind of empirically based in the first place. I don't want to convince them to do something that's not, already of interest to them or kind of aligned with it. The whole point is to say, here's data, isn't this helpful for the decision making that you have to make anyway?
Exactly. And I guess that then brings up this issue around like what doesn't work. So like with all the data that's coming out on learning and foundational learning, do we know like what doesn't work and what would not be put forward to a minister, or at least a minister might be dissuaded from going down that road? Like, do we have evidence on that sort of what works agenda or what doesn't work agenda?
Unfortunately, we have a lot of evidence on the what doesn't work agenda. It did not start out as that agenda. But yes, going back to the bit of the trajectory of how the global education sector has evolved, it went from schooling to a recognition of low learning to a focus on, okay, how can, now that we know that the low learning is a problem, like how can we improve it, which led to a lot of studies and evaluations and just efforts in general to improve learning that started with what would again be kind of the intuitive, maybe obvious things. And it was a lot of things that we refer to as kind of an inputs agenda. So like, let's provide the things that we think are associated with learning. So let's give more textbooks. Let's get more desks. Let's make sure every teacher has a chalkboard. Teacher training, interestingly, falls into this category as a type of input. Let's run another training program. And there's tons of data and studies now that show almost all of those had almost no impact. Laptops for children is on that list. There's lots of casualties to the efforts of trying to improve learning. It just didn't work, and we group them and often refer to them as kind of inputs that don't work on their own, usually because they're only trying to do one thing, right? Even a teacher training program, it's just a training. Like, what do they actually take back to the classroom with them? What tools do they have to incorporate that? Not really anything. And so it's really hard to achieve change from that. I also found the inputs by themselves just aren't that effective. So we do have quite a long menu of the things that I would recommend not to spend money on, given the choice.
But governments still do, right? It's always a question of like, why do they do that? Why are the things where we have evidence that suggests that these interventions don't work and yet they're still funded?
Couple reasons that I would say. One is there is a political angle to being able to show provision of things. Parents can see that there's new laptops in a school. It looks really good. It's really kind of politically salient. Teachers love teacher training programs. Oh great, like yeah, we'll go to another training. The government looks good when they're providing it. It sounds really good. It sounds very intuitive that it would be helpful. Learning, however, is often not very politically salient. And so it's much harder. It's less obvious. The parents don't see it right away necessarily. It's a little bit harder to report on. We were just talking about measurement. It's harder to report on. And so it's just harder to get the kind of the political credit, if you will, for doing that. In even a legitimate way, but it's just harder to show the success. So it's easier on those other areas. And then also because the inputs are just easier to provide. You can procure desks and get them to show up. You can procure chalkboards and get them to show up. Changing the dynamics between a teacher and a child in the classroom is much kind of a harder nut to crack. And so it takes a different level of commitment to make that happen.
And I would imagine like ministries of education are also being inundated by all these other actors who might not care too much about the evidence, but might be trying to sell a product or whatever it is. And there's a lot of lobbying that goes on in the, when the doors close in the minister's office. The reason for a policy choice might not be entirely based on the evidence. So I guess, now let's get into this what works. Like, based on this evidence, we now know things don't work. We know that learning is really valuable, but of course, how you achieve learning is sort of an open question, right? So what do we know about what works when it comes to improving foundational learning?
Yeah, so the good news is that we have made a lot of progress. If you trace back that evolution that I was just mentioning, we are now at a stage where we have moved through all the things that don't work very well and have moved on to now having a decent evidence base of things that do work. We actually do know a lot about what does work. And at kind of a principles level, the things that we're seeing do work address multiple constraints at once. So the way I was talking about inputs, they're usually just doing one thing. We're going to do training. We're going to provide these inputs. We're going to do this thing. The approaches that we are finding do work address multiple pieces of that puzzle at once. And so there's a couple approaches that kind of get a lot of attention these days. One is called teaching at the right level. Another is called structured pedagogy. That one especially is a bit of a wonky name, but what these approaches are doing are addressing multiple constraints in that education system at once and in an aligned way, in a way that's aligned for what children need to learn, with the skills that they need to be learning, and with the pace that they can learn them at. So these approaches, they do involve teacher training initially, but then that teacher training is also alongside ongoing support or coaching for the teachers. So they get visited in their classroom, they're getting input on how well they're applying the kind of pedagogy that they've been taught to use. It involves a clear scope and focus on foundational skills. So depth instead of a breadth. One thing that we see in a typical primary school classroom curriculum is that it's trying to cover so many topics that it's just hard to cover any one of them well. So teaching at the right level and structured pedagogy have this in common. They're focused on foundational skills, slightly different aspects of them, but still focused on the foundations. And then they have kind of materials that are aligned with that. And so they're addressing multiple things at once, and through that are able to achieve better impact on learning.
So can we zoom in on one of those sort of big categories of intervention, and that's the learning at the right level? What is that? Like, how do you begin to explain that to someone who's never heard that term before?
Yeah, teaching at the right level is, again, we've been talking about intuition a lot, but it's so intuitive when you describe it, but so counter to the typical approach to teaching in the classroom. It's quite radical, actually. It's an approach that was initially kind of developed and innovated by Pratham, one of the largest education NGOs that's in India and has since expanded to many additional countries. It is in many countries in Africa. And the idea behind it is to teach children at their current learning level, which is the really kind of intuitive part, and then follow them along as they master one skill, move them up to the next skill. And so it typically starts with a very basic assessment, so what we call a formative assessment, but an assessment to assess their skill level, usually across 4 main levels that they might fall into. So for literacy, can they recognize letters? Can they read a short word? Can they read a sentence? Can they read a short passage? So really quite basic that a teacher or a facilitator can, implement that assessment, identify right away which level this child is at, and then you group them. And then you teach them based on that group level. So instead of being taught at the grade level curriculum, they're being taught exactly where they need to be taught in order to learn that next skill. And so often this involves actually mixing across grades so that you're grouping children based on, it doesn't matter if you're in 4th grade or in 2nd grade, you're in the word reading group and you're going to be taught how to read words until you can read words, and then you get to move up to the sentence reading group.
So the idea here is like the grades themselves sort of disappear. So you do this assessment initially, this initial assessment, and then based on those outcomes, you group students accordingly.
For a short part of the day.
They're still in
They're still in normal. This is a really important point.
Yeah.
Because this is one of the areas where there's misunderstandings about teaching at the right level. And so often it's kind of a 1-hour remediation period. In some countries, they actually have a remediation day on Fridays. It might be an after school for an hour. But just to be really clear, they're not in these groups for the rest of the day. Just in these groups for this kind of 1 hour of remedial instruction to help them catch up on these skills that they've missed.
Okay. And then so the child could be in grade 2, and then 1 hour a day they go into these groups where they're in a group with students from all different grades depending on the skill they're at. And then they go back to grade 2 and finish their day.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Okay. So how does this actually then, and this might sound also stupid or intuitive, how does that improve learning?
Yeah, so because the children are being taught right at the level where they need to learn, they can engage in the instruction. So one of the big drivers that we see of the kind of learning crisis that we observe is that once children fall behind the level of the curriculum and instruction, they may stay in school, but they're not able to engage in that learning anymore. And so this is, I think at the top I mentioned learning trajectories that flatten off. So if children are in school, what we see is this kind of from grade to grade, there's some improvement in the early grades, but then if they haven't gained those foundations, their learning flattens. And so they're still in school. But again, if you think about it kind of intuitively, if you haven't learned addition and the teacher's teaching division, let alone calculus, way later in school. But even just before that, in the later grades of primary, so grades 4, 5, 6, if you haven't learned addition, but you're in school, you're not actually able to engage in what the teacher's teaching. They're teaching things and it kind of sounds like a foreign language. You're like, I just don't really understand these concepts. I can't put them into practice. And so that's the kind of business as usual. That's what's typically often the case for these children who are in school but not learning. And so the radical thing about teaching at the right level is we say, let's not try to teach a child who can't recognize numbers division. Let's teach them to recognize numbers first, and then move them up that kind of ladder until they're ready for those later skills.
I mean, I see it, but I guess that idea that they're still in a grade, and so they're only doing this for like a very short portion of the full day, like why not just group them in the group of the right level for the whole day and sort of get rid of grades? Like, is that too radical?
That would be radical. That starts to get into some of the more, there's a lot of, and a very controversial history of tracking children that we want to stay away from. That's not the goal. You don't want to put children on a track. What you actually want to do is catch them up so they can engage in the regular curriculum. So you actually don't want them to lose touch with their regular classroom. You want them to stay engaged in that regular classroom. You just want to help them get those skills necessary to engage. So the goal is actually to get them to a level where they can engage in their regular instruction. We actually don't want them to stay grouped forever. We want them to be able to engage. We just want to kind of speed them up on those foundations so that they can get there more quickly.
That makes sense. I can definitely see the value in that, even if the risk there is that in the beginning, while the student might be learning at the right level for a few hours a day or 1 hour a day, the other time that student might not be learning anything because they could be at such a low level of learning that everything that's being taught in the rest of the day is just sort of going over their head. But the idea is hopefully in time they will get caught up and be able to sort of understand the full day of lesson.
Exactly. Sometimes it's like 3 months and they're caught up. Right. At least they master the skills that teaching at the right level focuses on.
And there's evidence that this approach is working.
Yes, there's strong evidence for that. And like I said, it started in India with kind of multiple studies showing really strong efficacy evidence. And then it's also expanded now to Africa. It's scaling up nationwide in Botswana. It's at really large scale in Nigeria as well. It's in many different places and has proven impactful in a variety of contexts.
And are there any barriers to sort of scaling up this particular type of approach to, make it a sort of common feature of education, particularly in low and middle income countries?
Yeah, I think there's barriers to scaling anything. So yeah, there's always a set of barriers. Things that work at small scale, again, actually typically don't work at large scale. So the scaling challenge is always kind of front and center once you have something that you think is going to be effective or that's proven effective, but you want to make sure is effective at large scale. And this is actually what we focus a lot of our attention on at the What Works Hub, is saying we actually know a fair bit about some of these types of things that have been proven to be effective, but how can we ensure they maintain effectiveness at scale, implemented through government systems, embedded and institutionalized in the government system, trying to crack that. So a few of the things that are key to achieving that scale. So one is just achieving that kind of implementation fidelity at scale, making sure the teachers are actually doing it in the classroom. It's actually really hard. At a small scale, you can kind of observe and check and give support. At large scale, it's really hard. And we see, and as you do it in different contexts, and we have a study right now going on where it's, teaching at the right level is being tried out in a new context, and we're finding that teachers are really struggling with the grouping because it just goes against everything that they have been trained on, that they typically use in the classroom. It just feels too foreign to them, and they're really struggling with it. And so figuring out, okay, either how can we adapt the program to help them do that grouping? Can we adapt how the kind of grouping we're wanting them to do so it feels a little bit closer to something they can be comfortable with? Those are all kind of implementation fidelity barriers that take a lot of kind of active effort to focus on, and to kind of crack that ability to do it at scale. Yeah. Part of what it takes to do that, and again, something that we're really keen on at the Hub, is more efforts on measuring and monitoring implementation in the first place. So the other thing that we see is that often you say, well, just scale it up. Let's go do it in all these different districts and all these different contexts. But if you're not measuring it, you don't actually know how well it's working. And so making sure that we're measuring that take up, that fidelity. So we've been working on how do you define implementation measures. There aren't standard measures for implementation. How do you define those? And what's most critical to measure? Because you can't measure everything. But so we've been doing work to define, say in a Teaching at the Right Level program, what are the parts that are most essential for its impact And then how can we shape our implementation measurement around making sure those happen?
It's fascinating. I can see it being quite challenged. I mean, I keep going back to the word political, right? Like you're dealing with governments that are sort of, providing schooling for the most part and changing these massive systems for what is quite intuitive, teaching at the right level. And yet when you actually start breaking it down, it's like it is kind of a radical change that requires massive system change to get this right. So I guess to end, like, where do you see, the future of foundational learning going, right? Like, because you've been sketching this history and it's been quite nice to sort of see how this has evolved over time. Like, if you're looking into the future, where do you see foundational learning going next?
Ideally, we would see the scale up of these types of approaches that we know are effective in more and more contexts, in more and more kind of effectiveness. Getting there won't be straightforward, but, as we've been talking about here at this conference, actually, most of the funding of education in low and middle income countries and in all countries is existing government financing, existing government funding. And so tweaking what they're already doing, tweaking what they're already spending their money on is going to be the most effective way to get to scale with these. And so with both, again, teaching at the right level and structured pedagogy programs, biggest expense is teacher time. And when you implement through the government system, teacher salaries are already covered. You're just trying to tweak what that teacher's already doing in the classroom. And so there can actually be some low-cost ways to do that. I think figuring out how to do that and get it implemented, again, with fidelity is the big thing to crack, and that's what we're focusing a lot of our efforts on. But I would say that trying to capitalize as much as possible on existing government systems. I think we're definitely moving out of the world where NGOs are doing a lot of the implementation, where there's external actors that are kind of fundamental to effectiveness. We want to be trying to, and again, at the Hub, we're trying to investigate and study and identify effective pathways towards handing that over and getting it implemented in those government systems, supporting them to do that so that ultimately it's government owned, government implemented. And I think actually going back to even the difference between, I talked mostly about the similarities between teaching at the right level and structured pedagogy. What I didn't touch on are the differences. So teaching at the right level is typically used as a kind of remediation approach to catch children up on skills that they've missed. So it's usually in the later primary grades, 4th, 5th, 6th grade, catching them up on skills that they should have gained in grades 2 and 3, or grades 1, 2, and 3. Structured pedagogy actually tries to come in grades 1 and 2 and make sure children gain those foundational skills in the first place, so they don't miss out on them. And so some combination of these two, I actually think, is the answer, where we're trying to catch up the kids who haven't learned it while also trying to improve instruction in the first place, so there's fewer children who need remediation in the later grades, is going to be key. And then if I could set an ideal course for what comes next, if we could do that through the government system, I think that's how we get foundational learning.
Well, Michelle Kaffenberger, thank you so much for joining FreshEd.
Thanks, Will. It's been great talking with you.
Michelle Kaffenberger is the Director of Evidence Translation at the What Works Hub for Global Education at the University of Oxford. Her latest co-written synthesis brief was entitled The Benefits of Foundational Learning to Individuals and Society. Please note that opinions expressed on FreshEd are solely those of the host or the guest interviewed, not FreshEd, which takes no institutional position. If you've liked what you've heard today, please rate us wherever you listen to podcasts. Reviews really do help. FreshEd's team includes Fanti Octus, Obafemi Ngunle, Phyllis Che Mensa, and Jose Neto. Original music for FreshEd was created by Digital Primate. FreshEd is an independently run podcast without advertisements and is made possible by the support of the University of Canberra, NORAG, the Shakdev Family Fund, and listeners like you. Please consider donating to FreshEd by visiting freshedpodcast.com/support. Thanks for listening. I'm Will Brem, and I'll be back next week.